So I specifically I started thinking about, all right, well, let's think about sacred knowledge. And as it's like, I talk about research as ceremony all the time. And I thought, well, let's talk about it in a slightly different sense, because I think oftentimes what I end up talking about is just regular old boring research. Not that it's boring, because it's really will never do research nowadays that the community is asked for. But it's slightly different when you start to think about sacred knowledge and how that works in a research space. So if I put up this map, you probably all recognize what that map is. And it's kind of like if you do this sort of regular university introductions, and it's like all the different places that I've worked and papers that I've written and all that sort of crap. But that's a very specific perspective and very specific view on how knowledge works. And I hope that you realize something weird about that map too. So if I switch that map around a little bit, hopefully that makes a little bit more sense for you all down there. Oh, I should say up there, and if I'm down here. So if I introduce myself a little bit better, I'm from Opaskwayak, which is, so my river is the Saskatchewan River. So that is a picture of the Saskatchewan River. So part of my my land and my teachings is around that, but it was like, we don't really have mountains where I'm from, so I can't tell you what my river and my mountain. I can tell you what my river is, but we don't have mountains because we live on the Saskatchewan River Delta. So it's the really flat and it's really wet. So our sort of English name that we've given for our tribal people has been Swampy Cree. It's like we live in the swamps of the Saskatchewan River Delta. So that's, I guess, the Opaskwa Hills, which are kind of over here somewhere, are the closest thing we have to mountains, but they're not really mountains. And where I work right now is at University of British Columbia, which is down there. So yeah, that's where I'm from. And I hope that you recognize, when you're switching the perspective like that makes a big difference in how you look at things. So I really want to talk a little bit more about how our perspectives change, right? So it's important to recognize, the way that our classrooms have changed. So this picture is a picture of my dad when he went to the Indian day school in our community. So I don't know if you can see where my pointer is, but that's my dad right there. To go from that and then residential schools where the language and the culture was literally beaten out of us, into areas where we're starting to know how our classrooms have changed. So this is the Hale on University of Oahu, University of Hawaii West Oahu campus, and having places like Hale and Fale on university campuses is awesome. Our classrooms have changed. The way that we do research has changed because we have adapted and we've recovered, I think, a lot from the impact of colonialism and are doing things our own way again. But one thing that we need to think about also is how we go about changing our ceremonies. Okay. I think, our research has changed from being this colonial extraction of our knowledge into something now where it's us, we doing our own research for our own people, our own communities. So it's kind of like we also have to consider, our cultures change to adapt to our times, and how do we change our ceremonies to adapt in the same way? Which for a lot of people, that's kind of even sacrilege to say that, but I think that it's something we need to address at a certain point. And so that I'm happy to talk about this with an Indigenous audience. I wouldn't necessarily talk about this with a really sort of white stream audience, because it's kind of our internal business, I suppose. So I think for me, a big part of doing this, and I started thinking about, well, how the heck do we do ceremonies in an online space? So it's like, as we're doing today, we're having this teaching ceremony in an online space. So for me, the first part then of figuring out how that works was to actually go and do a ceremony. So I did a ceremony up on this headland up, well, it's just right around the corner from where these trees are right there. So these are some of the lessons that I got out of doing that ceremony and engaging with the knowledge that came to me from that land there. All right, so the first thing that was really important was part of the part of the ceremony itself was the journey to get to the ceremony site. So part of that is there's like a physical journey that I had to take in order to get there, but it's also really metaphoric as a spiritual journey and preparation of myself in a spiritual sense in order to enter that space where I was going to do that ceremony. So there's a big part of the deliberation and the intentionality of going there. Like, so I was walking to that space with the intention of doing something and having that in my mind, and so that I'm entering the space, entering into that space where the ceremony was going to take place with the sort of pure heart, if you will. All right. So there's that importance of the journey to get there. There's, again, a really important thing to think about too is the language that we use. So, all Indigenous languages come from the land. So part of my, I don't even know what to call it, impact of assimilation and impact of colonialism on my people is that I don't know Cree. So I can speak some words in Cree, but I definitely don't know enough Cree to be fluent in it. So my English is my first language. So that changes the way that I pray. So I can say prayers in Cree, but I can't, because it's I'm not fluent enough that it's like a first language where it just emerges from me. It's a translation process still. So I'm very conscious of the way that translation process changes the way that I pray. So the ceremonies have boundaries and limitations that are imposed upon them by the English language. So in recognizing those boundaries and limitations, it's really made me study a lot more about Cree philosophy and how we can use our philosophy to create new language. So hopefully some of the ceremonies that we start to create are a little bit more bilingual in that they are carrying the philosophy of our traditional languages, but we can still speak some words in English so that people can make that shift back and forth between the philosophies behind the languages. And the next thing I started to think about was, so where I did that particular ceremony was a space where there was, I'm going to run a little video here for you, and I hope that you can hear it. So if I'm here, it's relatively calm. It's like I can hear the traffic on the road, and it's totally part of this world. If I take a few steps out this way, it's windier and windier. So if I'm here, all I hear is the wind and the waves, and it's like that world is totally receded. But obviously, if I take a few more steps, I'm going to be totally in that world. So right here, so where I'm standing right now is really that transition zone where I'm still in one space, but I can really feel the turbulence of that, where there's the sharp transition zone. If I take a couple of steps back, I don't feel anything that way. If I take steps this way, I'm totally into that zone. So right here, it's like all the turbulence is happening right here. I forgot to unmute myself. How many times have you heard that over the past 2 years? Oh, you're on mute. Uh, so I was taking this, so that was a big part of the knowledge that came to me during that ceremony, was the importance of that transition zone and how you go between things, right? So I think that one of the things that all of us as Indigenous people are conscious of is the fact that change is inevitable. It's like change is always happening. Our planet has always changed. But we as Indigenous people have always had to be able to adapt to to the planet and adapt to the lands that we live on. So adapt to the country, adapt to the sky country, adapt to sea country. That is what our cultures are all about, is how we live on and with, not even on, how we live with land. And we aren't separate from nature, that we are a part of nature, and we really are close together with it, right? But we're also conscious that we're really conscious of, for me, really, it's conscious about how nature is changing so very rapidly. So I think that currently Indigenous people make up about 5% of the world's population. And I think that the guesstimate figures, because it's hard to find out accurate figures, is that community controlled and Indigenous lands make up approximately 20% of the surface of the planet, so like the water and the land mass. But that 20% and the lands that we control as Indigenous people and community organizations make up about 80% of the world's biodiversity. So we're still able to work with our land in such a way that we're maintaining that biodiversity that's really going to save the planet. So I think that because the 80% of the land that the sort of the mainstream people are in charge of is totally lost all its biodiversity. So it is, I think an impact is it's going to eventually die. So I think that we need to a little bit step forward as Indigenous people and be training more non-Indigenous people in how to behave properly. Otherwise, they won't have a future on this planet. So anyway, that change is inevitable. So I think that one of the things that we need to be a bit more conscious of, or a bit more careful about, is how we manage that change and do it deliberately or intentionally to make things better, to better fulfill our roles and responsibilities in relationship. Now, every nation, every people, every ceremony leader has their own protocols for how they do things. So I think that part of maybe that change is looking at the reasons behind those protocols and the philosophy behind them, so that we can maintain the principles and the philosophy behind them as we have to change some of our protocols to adapt to things like rising sea level. How on Samoa and Tonga, you're very much in danger of a lot of the land being lost as it goes underwater. So how do we sort of maintain the ceremonies that we do there in such a way that they remain relevant and they remain safe for the people? So a lot of that now is happening on the digital space, right? So as we are engaging here, we're stepping into the digital realm and starting to think about, well, how can we do our ceremonies online? Which is kind of, for me, it's like totally if you had suggested doing ceremonies online 20 years ago, people would have said that's impossible. It's not going to happen, right? But things have changed, and I think that's one thing that COVID has taught us, is we can put a lot of stuff online. So I work with a few different elders, and there was probably back in about September or October 2019. There were quite a few of us that all had different dreams, but all of the dreams had a similar message behind them. And that message was basically to the effect of that we need to find a way to get the land online, and we needed to do our ceremonies, figure out how to do our ceremonies online. So that was in September or October. Several of us had people had dreams about this. And then, we all know what happened in December of 2019 when COVID hit. So it was some of us were warned about this ahead of time. And so we started to think about this. And so this is a project that, the community project that I've been working on for a while, is trying to think how we do this stuff in an online space. So again, when I think back, all those things that I learned from the ceremony that I took part in, right? So then how do I apply those in a digital space? So again, the first thing was the importance of traveling and getting there. And I think that when we physically travel, there's a real deliberate separation of the spiritual and the physical zones. And that, ceremony leaders are really conscious of the danger of spiritual zones. Like there are places where great transformations can happen, but there also can be quite dangerous. So that we have to very carefully and deliberately move into those spiritual places, right? And then also we have to very deliberately leave them. So that was a big part of that lesson of learning about that transition. So it's like when I was on the land there, it's calm and it's relatively safe, right? When I was on the very edge of the headland where it's like really windy and turbulent, that's a really dangerous area. It can be really fun too, because it's like, if you want to go hang gliding, that's the place to do it. But it's also very dangerous. So that's where there's great changes are happening. But yeah, we have to be very conscious of how we step into that space and then step back out of it. So starting to think about this again with the digital space, how do we deliberately step into that in a safe way, but also deliberately step out of that? So this is very problematic when we start to think about, say, like our physical homes are the places where we're doing all our work. So it's like our digital offices are part of our home space, but they also become a spiritual space. So there's like a real danger in the blurring of boundaries there. So we have to be very careful to deliberately move into and out of space when we're starting to think about how we do ceremonies online. And just be a bit more conscious of that. All right. So at least I was thinking, like this example of this is like, at least go offline when you're going to go to use the toilet, right? You don't carry your phone with you in live stream then, but it's, we're all conscious of how we do that sort of in an office, but we have to be a bit more conscious of how we do that in a ceremonial space, and some things that we don't necessarily stream live, other things, need to be kept private. But just be a bit more deliberate about entering and leaving that digital space. Again, the importance of language. So I think that people like my children, who are now in their late teens and to mid 20s, are really the first generation of people that were raised in a bilingual sense, but not English Cree or English Maori or Tongan, but English and digital. So they speak digital language is probably even better than they speak English. So that is really changing the way that we as humans think, because there's real limitations around digital language. A binary language, because basically it's binary system, how it's working. How does that work with our analog brains? So it really changes. And I really actually noticed this with the way that teenagers, including my children, think, where they're very used to linear system, the flow chart designs of logic with, yes, no, like a whole series of yes, no decisions to make. So their whole decision process is changed that way. So it's like, it really changes, I think, that things like how they can step outside of that logic system, or to see the big picture view of things is I've noticed is really different than other people. There things like attention span is really short, so it's like they're especially when people are gaming, that rapid response that is required for gaming, it really changes their adrenal system, but it makes them and give them a sense of heightened awareness that's really good for ceremony. But inversely, it really shortens people's attention span when they're in a non-threatening situation. So it's, that good attention span is really good. I mean, that heightened sense of attention is really good for ceremony, but the shorter attention span is really bad for sitting in ceremony. Because you need that longer sense of ritual, what's happening there. So I'm also conscious of how being bilingual and binary has changed people's ways of thinking. And again, the importance of that transition zone. So I think that, when we work with elders and ceremony leaders are very conscious of the fact that when we go into that spiritual realm, when we're doing ceremony, we have to consciously maintain a sense of groundedness, because we can't be totally in the spiritual realm. I mean, if you're in the spiritual realm all the time, then basically your physical body dies. So that's where our ancestors that have passed on and totally entered into that spiritual realm, they don't no longer attached to a physical body. So ceremony leaders are very conscious of that and very careful about how we enter and move in and out of that spiritual realm, but all to maintain a strong physical connection to the land. So I think that when we start to add, so that's when I start to think about that transition zone, and then it's kind of like, well, we're already used to that with ceremony, and it's kind of like when you go to the beach and there's just like, we're conscious of the transition zone between the dry earth and the watery part. And we know how to be careful around that. But as soon as we go and add an extra layer on there of where going into the spiritual realm, maintaining our physical grounding, but we're also in a digital realm, it adds a whole nother layer of complexity. That's like then, rather than being like on a shallow beach, then we're kind of entering into a space where we're kind of on a headland where we've got the whole series of swirling wind there to also contend with. So we have to be really careful of how we manage that transition zone, because it's adding an extra layer of turbulence that makes it more dangerous. So a lot of our ceremonies, traditionally are deliberately designed to help us focus our attention, and they focus our intentionality. So we're all thinking about the same thing at the same time. And that's when miracles happen in our ceremonies. So now we're adding these whole other layer of it. We have to start to think about how we train our children and ourselves, retrain ourselves to add this extra layer of digital awareness in here. So we're able to maintain our intentionality, able to maintain our attention, for longer than just an adrenal response is going to give us, and just be conscious of that. And the other thing that is to be conscious of the role that the land itself plays in this. So it's like we're all aware of the role that the land plays in our real life ceremonies, right? But the land, it plays a just really crucial and strategic role in sort of shaping and storing and holding, and also the way that knowledge itself is shared. So the land can really heal us. But I'm also conscious of these days that the land can also really hurt us. And I've noticed that different researchers, especially in the far north, are really noticing now how with the rapid impact of climate change, how the land has become a source of anxiety for kids now, because when they go on the land, rather than being in a peaceful environment, they're being impacted by wind turbines, or they're being impacted by the encroachment of oil fields, or whatever it is, that the land has become a source of extra stress for a lot of kids. And the whole anxiety around climate change is making the land a source of stress for them rather than a source of healing, which is terrible. But just to have the importance of land. And I think that, all our traditional laws really come from the land. We store those laws in our star knowledge, in our stories in the stars, but the laws themselves come from the land. So if I start to think about those stories, they really teach, in Korea would call them Pastahawin and Chinawin, which teach us about natural law, and they also teach us about sacred law and how to behave ourselves properly, basically. So natural law is, what are the consequences of something? So it's like, if you stand up in a canoe, someone's going to fall in the water. So there's like a natural law sort of thing and a natural consequence. But there's a whole another layer of sacred law where if you disrespect water, that's going to have a whole different sort of consequence, not just on you, but on your children and then your, 7 generations of people. So being conscious of those stories and the laws and the way of behaving that they teach us is really important. So how that works again in a digital space, and how we store our sacred stories that teach people how to behave and how we monitor access to those stories once they're no longer tied to the land, but they're tied to a digital space, is a really important thing to consider. All right. So really, when I think about it for Cree people, the main sort of guides for behavior is really, it's the Sigiwewe, and the closest English translation is practice, love, and action, or living in a loving way. Maybe it actually is better even. This kind of flows easier in English, practice, love, and action. So part of that is, different actions that you do. Then it's laughing is a demonstration of love. So it's like, we're humorous people. That's good. But also we care about stuff. So when you are demonstrating caring, and when you're caring, you're demonstrating your love. So I think, so that's really closely tied to compassion. So it's like, when you care for other people, you're compassionate for it, or for the land itself, you're compassionate for it. And when you have that compassion, it forces you to be caring, because it's like, you can't then be empathetic. I mean, you have to have empathy rather than be apathetic. You can't be apathetic, because you have to, if you have compassion, you have to care about things. And when you start to care about things, then you share what you have. So you don't become, you're not hoarding, and you're not being greedy. You're actually sharing because you have that compassion. You care about other things, so you want to share everything with other people. But that requires a whole level of truth. And that truth is not just to, I guess that truth starts with being truthful to yourself, so that you're understanding these things. But then you're practicing truth with everything else around you as well.